So this time around we want to complete the all function, and this is a function that will return all movies currently in the database. And as I said a while ago, if we had a really large database of movies, this would not be appropriate. And we will change this later on, but for right now I just want to get a feed, a JSON feed, that shows me all of the movies that are currently in our database. So let's get started. So the first thing I'll do is use the context, as you should whenever you're working with a database, particularly with a web application or an API, because the user might just lose connection partway through the transaction, whatever the case may be. But we'll give this a reasonable timeout. So context with timeout, and we'll get it from context.background, and we'll give it a timeout of 3 seconds. Okay, and we'll defer cancel, and let's write our query. Now the nice thing about this is the query we want is already pretty much written for us up here. We just have to modify it. So I'm going to copy this and go back down to the bottom and just replace this with that query and remove this where ID equals 1 and change that to order by title. We'll order our movies by title. And now we want to get our rows. So rows and error are assigned the value of m.db.queryContext right there. And at the context, and at our query, and we have no other parameters to pass, so that's enough for that. We'll check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, return nil and error, and we'll defer rows close. Okay, so now we have our query. So let's create a variable to store our movies in, var, and we're returning a slice of pointers to movies, so let's create a variable called movies and make it a slice of pointers to movie. And now we'll iterate through our rows for rows.next. And the first thing we'll do is create a variable to store the current iteration, which I'll call movie, and it's just a movie. And now we'll say error is assigned the value of rows.scan, and we'll just scan it into our movie variable. So ampersand movie, the first variable is ID, and I'll duplicate that a few times. The second field is title. The third field is description. The fourth one is year. The fifth one is release date. The next one is rating. After that comes runtime. After that comes MPA rating. And then created at and updated at, which we don't need, but I like to be thorough. Created at and updated at. Okay, so if there's an error, we'll return it. If error is not equal to nil, return nil and error. Now we want to get the genres. Now we can just go up and copy the code we used before and modify it as necessary. So we'll say get genres if any, and we'll just copy all of this down to here and go back down here. And this is code duplication, and I'm aware of that. And if you want to clean it up and break things out into functions, you feel free to do so. I just want to get this running for right now. So I'll paste this in, and we have to make some changes, obviously. So let me tab this over and format the whole thing. We can't call this query because we already have a query, so I'll call this genre query. And that all looks the same, so this becomes an assignment operator. And we copy this. And we can't call this rows because we already have a rows variable, so I'll call this genre rows. And we don't want to defer the close. You shouldn't defer a close inside of a loop, of course. So this becomes movie.id for the current movie. And this becomes genre rows. Oops, try that again. Copy, paste, paste. And I think that's all pretty accurate there. But down here, after we finish the for loop, we want to say genre rows close. We'll manually close that. because that won't execute until this loop is finished, so that should be fine. And we have movie genres equals genres, and down here instead of return nil nil, we actually want to append, let's see what we call that variable, movies. Okay. Down here we assign that, and then just before we continue the loop we say movies equals append movies and a reference to movie, because this is a slice of pointers. And now we return movies. Alright, so if I format that, that all looks good. We have one error here, genre query. That one has to be this query right here. Okay, so let's just go through this and see if we've got it right. So, we set up our context. We have our query, which will get us all the movies ordered by title. We store that query result in the rows variable. We defer our rows close. We define our movies variable to hold the final result. We iterate through the rows variable and scan the current row into our movie. That's right. Check for an error. Then we create a new query for genres, and that's going to use movie ID, which is set up on line 95, so that's correct. Then we create our genres map, and then we loop through our genre rows, scanning the genre information into a movie genre variable. That's correct. And then we set our map value, and then we close our rows once we're done looping through the genre rows. That's correct. Then we assign genres to the movie genre field of the movie variable and append a reference to the movie variable to our slice of movies and return it. That looks good. Okay. So now we need to go to our handlers. So let's find our handlers, movie handlers. And we need to make a change here. First of all, I can get rid of this commented code because we don't need that anymore. But we definitely should check for an error. So we check for an error, but we never did anything. If there's an error, we say if error. We're just fixing up the get one movie. If error is not equal to nil, then I want to write a JSON error. So I say app.errorJSON, and I hand it the response writer and our error. And I'll just return, even though I don't need to. Okay, so here, this should be a really short and simple function. We declare a variable movies, check for an error, and we call app.models.dbAll, like that. So it looks like I have an error in my movies DB. Let me go back there. Am I calling for a parameter I don't need? Yes, I am. Get rid of that ID. That shouldn't be there at all because we're getting all the movies. So back to our handlers. Okay, so now we check for an error. So I can just copy and paste this right here. Okay, so once we have those, we just call error is equal to app.writeJSON. And we hand it our response writer, our status, http.status OK, and a wrapper, which I'll call movies. And again, we check for an error, and I should be able to just paste that in. Okay? And of course, we need to give this the actual data, movies, comma. So I think that should work. So let's start our application. Go run ./cmd/API. And let's go to our web browser and see if we can call that root. So right now we're doing version 1 movie 1. Let's just make sure that still works. It does. Now let's change that to /movies. So /v1/movies, hit return, and there it is. Perfect. So there's no genres for this one or this one or this one, but there are the genres for the Shawshank Redemption. And everything is formatted nicely. So that was relatively straightforward. Now we do have to come back and work on this a little bit later because we're going to want to chunk the results, maybe 10 movies per page or something like that. But for right now, we have enough to move along.